Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Emma, and I'm here with Backlog, and so is Genna.
Are you able to see me advance through the slides?
I am. I think we're on number 4. You hit the bar at the bottom
Oh,
instead.
geez. Sorry. Yep, you're right.
It's fine.
Great start, everyone.
I just want to quickly explain who we are. Backlog is an archival consulting firm, and we're based in St. Louis. I founded Backlog after I was laid off during the pandemic. I found that a lot of places need just a little bit of help, but not necessarily someone full-time, and that's where we come in. So we do archival consulting, which really just means if somebody has a problem and they email us, we can help them solve it. It's a lot of policies and procedures, writing those for places that have an all volunteer staff. We've done some volunteer training. And then we also host softwares like Omeka and Archive Space. And then on top of that, we also do genealogy research. Right. And I'm Emma. Backlog is my company. I started after I was laid off. I started after I was laid off during the pandemic. One of the first projects I had was I'm at St. Louis University High School for 20 hours a month, and they were our first client. And so it's been fun to be with them for 2 years now.
And I'm Genna, so I'll be doing the presentation today. So I am coming to you from my kitchen in New England. For a long time, I was a ranger in a university archive by myself. And so I've recently switched to museum archives, but I specialize in project management, policy and workflow development, processing and digitization.
So we'll do a Q&A at the end. We are recording this, and I will email it out to everybody tomorrow. And then any links that we mentioned today will be in the recording description on YouTube, which is where we'll post the webinar.
All right. So to get started, so thanks for being here today, everybody. So the sort of thesis, I guess, for this presentation is that language can be a weapon. And throughout history, language and developing particular words and vocabularies has been used to dehumanize, disenfranchise, or other various minority groups. And so in describing historical materials, we have the opportunity to provide access to these materials that often tell very difficult histories without ascribing to that same violence by repeating the words that they used, or and beyond particular words, but the language and the way that they wrote about particular people. Some examples include the specific legal terms that were developed under the Third Reich to classify individuals based on their level of Jewish heritage, or the American practice of creating words that did the same to individuals with Black heritage. How, were they, a quarter, an eighth, etc. I don't want to show a bunch of examples of problematic description or outright offensive description and say, like, don't do that. This is how to make it better. I don't want to focus on examples of archives causing harm, but instead on how we as memory and cultural workers can be proactive in engaging in practices of care. In this presentation, I'm not going to say words that are still used as painful slurs, but in researching primary sources related to these topics, you may come across them. I mean for this presentation to spark ideas and questions about justice and empathy in archival description, and I hope it will inspire everyone to read and think further about these topics. This is just going to get you started. You can still dive deeper into so many amazing resources, which we're going to share. And I'd like to think I'm giving you a map for this journey that's based on landmarks, but not a GPS, because based on your work and your experience, certain topics might be more relevant to you and your work. So I'd like for us to think through some potential biases that can creep into our archival description and strategize places to pause that we can write more humane descriptions. So another sort of foundational idea that is from which we are going to proceed for the rest of this presentation is that archives are not neutral, and even an accurate description is still a subjective one. So any archival description reflects the experience and the bias of the writers, even when we're not talking about people or culture or anything controversial. If you've got particularly controversial or incendiary materials in your collections. So obviously, I had to bring in a picture of a cat. If you look at this photo and you were writing an archival description of it, how would you describe it? What choices would you make in how you described it, about the colors, the plants, vocabulary? Do you have horticultural knowledge or contextual knowledge to say like what kind of flowers those are, what kind of cat that is? Would you notice the hammock in the background? Do you know the location? Do you not know the location? Based on what you know in your life and your personal experience, you are going to bring that to the description of this or any other image or archival object. And so because everyone's description will be different, everyone's particular cultural biases can also come into play. So as I said, archives are not neutral. And so when I talk about empathy and dignity, I'm talking about recognizing people's dignity in describing them in archival materials that might not treat them with dignity. But we're recognizing it, we're not granting it, because people's dignity is inherent. I want to promote how archival description can embrace change and this kaleidoscope of ways of being that we have in our world. For just a suggestion for starting in your archival description journey, avoid using euphemistic or charged language. Consider how the passive voice changes a sentence. So to say someone was killed versus a person killed another person really changes the perspective of the narration, as well as what people might interpret from reading it. And consider what states of being are you assuming are the default? Are you describing the race of only certain people in a photo or the gender of only certain people in a photo? Because you're kind of assuming this person doesn't need to be described because we're assuming that that is sort of a default. Archives are not neutral, not only in how they describe, but in what they choose to have in their collections and how they interact culturally with people in the past and the present. So we are recognizing dignity of people in the past, but in doing so, we are showing care to people in the present who are encountering these materials. So a concept that I think has been really influential in the archives field in the past couple of years is radical empathy. And there's a really great article a few years ago called From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives. And a guiding question from that article is the descriptive language I am using respectful to the larger communities of people invested in this record? So the article proposes practicing an ethics of care in archives work. And it develops a framework that binds archivists to records creators, subjects of the materials, the users of the materials, and the wider community. These are all relationships of care that archivists can practice. And the empathy is radical if it guides the work of archives regardless of the interaction. So reparative description is something that the Society of American Archivists defines as remediation of practices or data that exclude, silence, harm, or mischaracterized marginalized people in the data created or used by archivists to identify or characterize archival resources. So going back to your finding aids or your image metadata or whatever descriptions that you have, and looking at the language used to describe marginalized people and rethinking it and making changes. There's also the Sunshine State Digital Network, which has workshops on conscious editing, which is a similar concept, that it says it's important because traditional cataloging and archival description often excluded figures deemed unimportant, making it almost impossible to research marginalized people, hiding in the richness of historical record and alienating communities who can't see it themselves in our collections. So conscious editing is going back into your records and your description and seeing what people are part of this story, but were not included in the description because they weren't deemed important. I like to give an example. This is more of a collecting example, but when you're doing oral histories at a university, everyone wants to interview all the past presidents and trustees and faculty, but is anyone interviewing the person who's worked in housekeeping for 20 years, or facilities, who's seen every single change to the campus structure? Are those people being perhaps mentioned in an oral history but not included in the metadata? So who is important and who is unimportant? These are things that you can address with conscious editing and reparative description. So in considering who's missing, think about what quote unquote minor figures are missing from narratives, biographies, and historical notes. Research the names and actions of people who were part of a story, but maybe they're missing from the metadata or from the finding aid narratives. And try to create, try to contribute names to local and national controlled vocabularies and authorities, like social networks in archival context, or SNAC, which I have a screenshot of here. SNAC is a way of connecting people to other individuals who were perhaps their correspondents, perhaps their family members, or business partners, so that if a person is doing research, they are able to find, oh, well, here's a collection about this person, but they were really closely connected in their work with all of these other people. So it helps connect people's work to related work, and then helps researchers find everything relevant to their research. And so this is the SNAC entry for the Public Universal Friend, who, if you've never heard of, is a really fascinating person. The friend was a preacher and religious thought leader in the early years of the American Republic. I like to use the friend as an example because this is a person with a broad network of associates and correspondents. And this information is important to understanding religion in early America. The friend also challenges us to think differently about how we as archivists and historians describe people, because the friend was genderless and did not use gendered pronouns, possibly not any at all, because people always referred to the friend as the friend or public universal friend, never with any pronouns. So in thinking of how we describe people, this is a thought exercise in how we can use different tools available to us, and just to think, how are we making assumptions about people, and how can we remedy that? So this is from a photo description that I did at one of my past jobs. So you can see that I quoted what was written on the back of the photo here, which just said, Mr. and Mrs. for these two couples. But in the archivist supplied description and the title, I actually included the names of these wives. And I had to go back and I had to do some research and figure out what were the names of these women, because their names were not in our archives. And sometimes I couldn't find the information. And that's troubling. And I did have to just stick with Mrs. But, what if a man had 3 wives and all of them are only referred to by his name, Mrs. John Smith or whatever? Their individual histories disappear. So it's worth it to give them back a little bit of their individuality, because they are separate people with their own stories. And it's a really small change. And, these women might never see the description, but it places them into the historical narrative as their own people. Another practice that I found really useful in my past job was creating alternative names in archive space. So depending on what archives management system you use, you might be able to do this, where you create an authority record for a person, but then you also are able to add alternative names. And I did this for several nuns, because I was working for a religious university, and there were a lot of nuns in the university's history. And in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of nuns switched from their religious names that they chose back to their original baptismal names, but not everybody. So it was really useful to be able to link all of these different names that I might see throughout the university's history and unite them so that it was clear that this is one person. So this person's work is being recognized. And, people occupy many different names throughout their lives sometimes. So I was able to use the data tools at my disposal to improve the ability of myself and historians to tell the institution's story. When people refer to a person who has changed their name for any other reason by a past name that they have purposely discarded, that is what I'm talking about when I say avoid dead naming, which is particularly relevant if someone has transitioned gender. While maintaining historical continuity can be a concern, it's important not to disrespect the subjects of our archives by calling them by a name that they discarded, perhaps because it was traumatic or they just do not feel that it reflects them. Consider what tools you have that can do justice to a person's life by calling them what they wanted to be called. And I also skipped over this part. Avoid assumptions about people's occupations, relationships, roles, or experiences. When you're writing descriptions, are you assuming that a woman is a nurse and not a doctor, for example? And also consider that there are cultural differences in gender. So if you're unfamiliar with the expression of gender in the materials that you're describing, really do the research to make sure that you know what you're talking about, essentially. A resource that I think every archivist should read is the Antiracist Descriptive Resources, which first came out a few years ago. And a few of the main takeaways are that humanity is more important than our metadata standards. So our metadata standards state that a person needs to have a first name and a last name. But what if you're talking about a person who was enslaved their entire life? It's not justice to give them the name of the person who enslaved them if they did not choose that name. So, and I actually used this resource working on a project where we were digitizing and describing probate records in early New England history. And because they were probate records, people's estates and wills being recorded by the town government, they included enslaved people as part of the estates, along with furniture and livestock and land. So we found these really useful to make sure that we were being as empathetic as we could in recognizing that these are human beings, and the one place where they might be documented in the historical record is not as people, but as property. So that's what I mean when I say consider how the document treats the person. What was their civil personhood, their legal personhood? And even if they are not being treated as a human being, in your description, find ways to recognize their humanity. Other tips from these resources: use the terminology preferred by a group in describing them, avoiding the passive voice, and avoiding valorization, which I think is really interesting. That's really just a practice when you're describing someone in you say finding aids, and you are really propping them up. Everyone is complicated, and only talking about someone's good deeds and not including, say, the fact that maybe they were also slaveholders is disingenuous to the historical record. So recognize people's faults as well as their accomplishments. And I've actually got two laptops going here to do all of this. So one of those tips was to call people what they call themselves, or sort of self-determination of particular nations of people. I've used this example because you'll see down in the quoted part of the text, the man in the photograph is described in a particular way using a word that is generally considered to be a slur. But the title and the description refer to him as Romani, which is that is what that group uses to describe themselves. So that's one particular context. Another is to use specificity with Indigenous nations. I believe that there are over 500 Indigenous nations in the United States. They are not a monolith. And be specific when you're talking about particular tribes, what names they actually use. Another example, people who are Diné do not use the word Navajo to talk about themselves generally. I think that might still be the federally recognized term. I'm not sure. That is a gap in my knowledge. So that's not necessarily a slur, but that's not how people want to be referred to as. That was a very convoluted sentence. People do not want that term applied to them. And some cultures might want to reclaim words that were used in a derogatory way to describe them, but people outside that culture should not do so. And this goes for across any community to any other community. If you're not part of that community, you're not able to take the derogatory power out of a word. So don't use it. Talking about disability could be its own presentation. The primary description and journalistic advice for a long time was to always use people first language to say, a person with this disability, rather than saying disabled person, but that's pretty complex because some communities of people with particular disabilities want to be referred to as, for example, the autistic, an autistic person rather than a person with autism. But not every person is in agreement about that, and not every community of people with disabilities is the same any more than any individuals are the same. If you are describing materials related to any sort of medical conditions or disabilities that include offensive or outdated terms for that particular disability, particularly mental disabilities, replace them in your narrative description with modern, updated terms. And I chose this image because I've seen a lot of bad description around wheelchairs, but it's very literal in his description of this woman in a wheelchair. We don't know why she's using it or how frequently she uses it, if it's permanent, if it's temporary. The title does not call her wheelchair bound or make any assumptions about her physical condition. And that's important. And I mean, not making assumptions in general is, it always comes back to that. We're not making assumptions about a person's experience based on what we're looking at. We're only looking at the evidence and the desires of people in that community and how they want to be described. So the idea of trigger warnings has gotten really politically fraught, but I think they can be really helpful. The screenshot here is from the Digital Library of Georgia. It just pops up when you go to their digital library, and it just kind of puts you in a place to prepare you before you go into their collections. This preparation allows researchers to be in a thoughtful place for archival encounters with dated language regarding disabilities, race, etc., as well as images of violence and oppression. Warnings are not censorship. People are still going to see the words or images that are potentially harmful, but the metadata does not repeat it, and the warnings prepare the person to actually see those things. And it's not censorship, as I said, but we're preserving the language but contextualizing it and avoiding reinscription of trauma by not using harmful language in the metadata, and by warning people before they encounter these archival materials what it is that they might encounter. So obviously there's a lot going on in the world, and there might be changes, and it can be a lot to keep up with, but depending on the collections that you have, certain changes might be more relevant than others based on the topics covered. So where do you look if you want to find, what are the preferred terms, if you want to connect with people actually in a cultural community whose materials are in your collections? Some places to look are national associations for cultural, ethnic, or religious groups. Controlled vocabularies cannot always keep up, especially the really big ones like the Library of Congress subject headings. So you might need to stray away from those in order to bring the most care to the subjects of your archival materials. Learn from other memory workers and their collections, and involve community stakeholders in describing collections related to their history and their culture. Bring people in, welcome feedback. This is actually a form that you can use to send a correction, or also a, hey, I don't think this phrasing or this term is the best to use when you see archival descriptions at Yale. So I have actually used this when I noted something in their collections that was an outdated way to refer to something, and this is something that they welcome. And there's been a really big effort at that institution to redescribe, practice reparative description, and draw in lots of feedback so that they can revise all of their archival description. Sorry, I keep bumping my mouse. So in incorporating empathy into your descriptive practice, recognizing what you don't know and what's outside your own experience is really important, because that's how you know when to ask for advice. So seek cultural consulting when necessary and compensate people for their time. A person with a particular cultural experience does not owe you their labor to help you redescribe your materials. So even if it's just a token, an honorarium, and there are organizations that are starting to develop honorarium funds for archives to do this type of work. For example, New England Archivist has a fund called the Racial Honorarium. Sorry, I'm rambling. They have an honorarium fund so that if you want to hire a consultant to, say, look over materials related to Indigenous collections, and you don't necessarily have the money to pay them, you can apply for this fund so that you can actually pay that person, compensate them for their cultural knowledge, as you would a person with a particular, programming skill or something. Consider general cultural terms that might not be accurate, that have found their way into your collections, and question what you're leaving out. What makes you uncomfortable in describing archival materials? And I'm not saying you need to find like the worst examples of everything in your archives and bring all of that into the description, but are you glossing over the uglier parts of history when you're writing a finding aid? Say, like, actually, there's a whole series of correspondence related to the buying and selling of human beings in this collection. Are we not talking about that in the finding aid because it makes us uncomfortable? So, I mean, that's very, very general, very, context-based, but just something to consider when you are developing your descriptions. So if you decide that you need to go back and start redescribing, some things to consider, whether maleness and whiteness are being treated as default. So as I said earlier, are you only describing someone's gender or race if they are not male or not white? And maybe you're not, that's great if you're not, but just consider if that is something that you're doing and rectify it. Really small projects can make a really big difference. You don't have to decide you're going to rewrite 100 finding aids. You can do small targeted projects, especially if you have relationships with communities that are willing to collaborate with you. You have to dedicate time to doing the research. Sometimes you are tracking down one person's name and it feels like a drop in the ocean, but it means something. And finding aids can change. We have update capabilities built into finding aids, even if you are hand coding them. So finding aids are not meant to be static documents. So don't worry about going back and changing them because the archives aren't going to change. You're updating your description. So seek opportunities for collaboration and group remediation of archival language, and welcome suggestions and feedback. And sometimes there are uncomfortable conversations to be had, but they're not necessarily adversarial. And getting through the uncomfortable conversations about your collections and how they're described is what's going to lead to actual care in your community. So I also briefly want to cover the A in DEAI is accessibility. So we talk about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. So how are you making your archival descriptions accessible to users? If someone is physically coming into your collection, into your reading room, or if they are just trying to look up collections online, like how accessible are your collections to people with any level of any type of disability or variation in life experience? Are you providing transcriptions for audio materials? Are you providing alt text? Are you providing detailed descriptions of photographs so that a person doesn't necessarily have to be able to see the materials in order to understand them? So there's physical access and digital access. Is your reading room comfortable for someone who has any sort of mobility concerns? Are there frequent language barriers that you're encountering with your user communities? And I also think it's important in your reading room to balance the security of the collections with welcoming users into the collection to use them. I think archives can be a really unwelcoming place for people who are not necessarily academic scholars, or perhaps are not part of, they're new to town and they don't maybe feel like the historical society is for them. So going in and doing a ton of paperwork and providing an ID might feel hostile to particular people. So, do you need ID? Do you need to ask for ID? How much paperwork do you need to have a person fill out? Is a logbook sufficient? I stopped asking for ID when I realized the entire time a person is using my collections, they are 2.5 feet from my desk, and I am looking directly at them the whole time, because the reading room was also my office. So it was just a small step to make the reading area feel a little bit less surveilled, I guess is the word I want to use. And so bringing empathy to archival practice doesn't just mean choosing the content of the description, but how that archival description is presented and how it gets to people, and if it is transmitted in such a way that people are able to access it. And we want to promote trust in our communities both ways. We trust our users so that they are able to trust us as the holders of particular collections. So what do we do with all of this? Improving inclusivity and performing reparative description or conscious editing. These are all iterative processes. They're never done. And we don't have to set a goal for, we'll have all of our reparative description done by this date, because you'll never be done. And that's okay. That's good. Language evolves, cultures evolve. And so we are evolving our descriptions to go along with the changing tides of history and our own culture. So welcome feedback from outside or inside your archive. Take in suggestions, and welcome calling in, which is a phrase I really like. Sometimes a reprimand is a call out, like, look what this person did. But sometimes it's a calling in, like, hey, I don't think that you meant to use this word in an offensive way, but it really isn't accurate, or it's not the preferred term for a particular community. So I prefer if you didn't use that. That's calling in. That is starting a conversation. And I think responding to suggestions or feedback or calling in with defensiveness is shutting down the conversation. So I really recommend seeking and appreciating the advice of people whose lived experience connects with your collections, because that's why we're doing this. I mean, all of our collections cease to matter if there are not people whose lives are represented by them, people who want to access them, reasons for that history to be relevant. So archives exist to be used, and connecting people to the past means connecting with them in the present and bringing care to that interaction. So that is my piece. We're going to talk about a couple of upcoming workshops and webinars that we have coming up, and then we'll have a discussion.
Yeah, we'll take questions in just a minute. On Sunday, we're doing a webinar on preserving early digital photographs. So if you guys had like an old point and shoot camera, oftentimes they had a proprietary photograph like file type, not unlike the new HEIC with Apple. So we'll kind of go over how to organize and how to convert those different files.
And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking about students in the archives. I'm specifically student workers in the archives. I've had undergraduate students, graduate students, with very different backgrounds and majors and skill levels, and very unique skills in the archives. And I want to share some of this wisdom with you. And a few weeks after that, I'm going to be talking about cultural heritage and climate change. which is something I'm really passionate about. I'm a founding member of Project ARC, which is Archivists Responding to Climate Change. So it's an organization that's interested in discussing how the archives field contributes to climate change, like through server use, and how we can combat that, as well as how the changing climate affects our physical collections. So I'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks.
And my email's on this slide if anybody has any questions or has anything they'd like to speak to us about. Okay. And then right now we'll take any questions if anybody has any. You can go ahead and unmute and say your question or put it in the chat.
And I actually can't see the chat. So Emma, could you let me know if there's anything?
Yeah.
Hi, Jean McManus here.
Hi.
I just want to say thanks for really a good presentation. I like how holistic you were in touching on the environment as well as the materials themselves and thinking about our users and talking about that. So I don't really have a question, but I appreciate the ideas about finding the right language to use by contacting maybe some national groups. That's going to prove, I think, very useful in things that we have to uncover with collections relating to Indigenous persons that are simply described as Indian in tons and tons of instances. It's there's a lot of work ahead of us, I think.
Yeah, but I think there's also there's so many opportunities for actually building community and a different user community, a different description community. So that's going to be really interesting as well. And I'm sure that there are topics that I have left out or glossed over. So this is definitely just here are some thoughts that I have about this topic. And there are many other perspectives on improving description. So thank you.
And Jenna, we have a question in the chat. She's asking if you could repeat the information about the honoraria funds for cultural consultants.
Oh yeah, it's for New England Archivists, it's the Racial Justice Honorarium Fund. Sorry, I know I completely garbled that before, and I was just hoping to keep skipping along. So that's offered through New England Archivists, which is newenglandarchivist.org. And depending on your location, you might have a different regional archives group. So there are some other racial justice type honorarium funds to help pay for cultural consulting. I don't know the names of any off the top of my head, but I know that New England Archivists based theirs on other programs that exist. And also, I mean, grant funding also is a potential source for funding your cultural consulting.
Okay. And I will email out a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow. So if you need us to repeat any information, it'll be in the recording tomorrow. But if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks, and have I don't really want to say a happy Juneteenth, a thoughtful Juneteenth.